Hey, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back, guys. We are finally wrapping things up here. World War One has been going on for 4 long years at this point, and we are getting to the end of the Great War today. They called this the war to end all wars before it was called World War One, and so they looked at this as, hey, after this, there will be no more war. And so we'll talk over the next unit about how that is going to work and if that will work. And we know that obviously it won't when it comes down to it. So let's take a look at how things wrap up here when we talk about World War One. So as we see, eventually this war obviously was contained in Europe. It's going to become more worldwide, and the reason for that is kind of twofold. Number one, the colonies start to become involved as well, and so a number of the resources from around, or a number of the colonies, I should say, from around the globe, the European countries need those resources from those colonies in order to continue the war effort. We read a little bit about the German home front. Things weren't good. They didn't have the things they needed at home. They needed to bring in resources from their colonies and other parts of the world. So they had the ability to continue to fight this war. Again, this became a war of attrition. Whichever side could outlast the other side, essentially. And so that's kind of what it comes down to. The other big thing is the United States eventually does get involved here. The United States is not involved very long in World War One, and you could argue that we don't affect things all that greatly. The thing that we do kind of allow the United States to kind of do is basically they change the tide of the war. All right. They kind of brought in new life, I guess you can say, because we had brand new soldiers who were coming in that could kind of fortify the other soldiers who were already there. And that's what eventually turns the tide of the war, is that the Allies are able to bring in a brand new country that hadn't been fighting, that hadn't been broken down, that had the resources they needed at that time to eventually win the war. Now, what eventually brings the United States in? There's a couple things that do that. All right. Number one is unrestricted warfare was restarted by the German U boats. And so Germany had been kind of blockading the Atlantic Ocean, and they had been essentially sinking any ships that they believed were going to Britain or France. The idea was they didn't think that anyone should be aiding their enemies in the war, all right, getting involved in the war if they weren't part of it. And so Germany actually took out, you can see the advertisement right here that was in the United States. They actually took out an ad, and they kind of announced this, that they were going to resume unrestricted warfare, which basically meant they would sink any ships that were coming to their enemies. Prior to this, they would basically unload the ship. They would tell people that they needed to get off. They would evacuate the ship, and then they would sink it. Now they're saying they're just going to sink the ship, people in it or not. All right. And so that upset the United States. Obviously, we talk about the idea of the international waters, right? If you're in international waters, if you're in the middle of the ocean or the sea, no one owns that territory. And so the fact that the Germans are doing this kind of goes against the law of the international waters, or the law of the seas. The other thing that really upsets the United States is one of our ships, or I should say a ship that contained U.S. citizens, was sunk by the Germans. All right, and so that's the ship, the Lusitania. And that's one of the final straws that kind of leads to the United States coming into World War One. Now, Lusitania, the argument was it was a passenger vessel and a cargo ship, essentially, that was sunk. There was American citizens on it who died. The ironic thing is, a lot of historians look back at it and say, well, the ship was struck by a torpedo on one side, and the opposite side of the ship blew up. So what that means is most likely the ship was carrying ammunition. And so the United States was sending ammunition and aid to Great Britain, who was, we know Britain is one of our closest allies, but that's not legal during wartime. We were aiding one of the other countries here that was going against Germany, and so we were actually kind of bringing ourselves into the war with that aid. And we've talked a little bit about the United States kind of helping at that point. We also see that the Zimmerman Note was kind of another one of those final straws that led to the United States getting involved. And so when we talk about the Zimmerman Note, this is kind of what it was. After the Lusitania is sunk by the Germans, Germany did agree to stop unrestricted warfare, but again, they started back up again in 1917. So they continued to do this. But the last straw to the United States finally entering the war was the Zimmerman Note. Basically, what happened here is the United States intercepted or found a telegram that was coming from the German ambassador to the Mexican embassy, and the idea was that basically the letter said, "Hey, if you join with Germany and attack the United States, then we will make sure that you get back what the United States took from you." All right. Keep in mind, the United States had, years earlier annexed Texas, and a good portion of the American Southwest was part of Mexico at one point. And so the idea was Germany was saying, "Hey, go attack the United States on their southern border from Mexico, and we'll make sure that we can aid you in any way, and that'll obviously keep the United States out of any war effort and dealing with them in Europe." We intercepted this telegram. Whether or not you want to believe it's 100% accurate, or if it was slightly made up or exaggerated, whatever it might be, the United States saw it and realized that Germany is our true enemy here, and we entered the war on the side of the Allies. So our British and French counterparts, we came in there and decide that we needed to aid them. This happens right around the exact same time that Russia drops out because of the Russian Revolution going on at home. And so because of that, the United States is able to help turn the tide of the war with all the fresh troops and all the supplies that we're able to bring in for the Allies. Now, were Americans great soldiers? Did we turn the tide because we were so amazing? No. Not at all. In fact, most Americans that were coming over to Britain at that time and then heading to Europe, they were called doughboys by the British, excuse me, and that's because they were basically fat. All right, so think of like the Pillsbury Doughboy, a bunch of fat troops going over there that had no training or very little training. They are actually the ones that do help turn the tide of war. Even though they maybe weren't the most well trained at that time, it was new bodies and new supplies and new resources to help the Allies win. Okay. And so, at the 11th hour of the 11th month of the 11th day in the year 1918, November 11th, they had an armistice. They decided, hey, this is it. The war was over. That's where it was. The Allies essentially win the war here, and Germany surrendered. This was kind of their last ditch effort. They weren't able to continue the war anymore at this point. All right, and so the war was over. They called that Armistice Day. Today we call it November 11th is Veterans Day. All right, so a little bit change, but not just celebrating World War I veterans, but also celebrating all veterans of foreign wars now. So that brings the war to an end, ladies and gentlemen. Now we have to find out what happens after the war ends. All right, just because the war itself, the fighting itself is over, doesn't mean the diplomacy and the changes and the issues aren't over yet. All right, so we're going to see how the kind of mop up here, or the resolution to the war, basically leads us right into our next war. All right, so if you have any questions, as always, guys, go ahead and ask your teacher, and we will see you again soon.